The sound of rushing water echoed through the canyon as I stood there in my rain boots, watching 30 years of memories drain away into the valley below. Behind me, Karen's voice cracked as she screamed into her phone. 911? Yes, this is an emergency. Someone has. They've stolen our lake. I didn't turn around. I just kept watching the water disappear, carrying with it every fish, every cattail, every reflection of summer sunsets that had made this place home. My hands were shaking, but not from the cold mountain air. They were shaking because after 6 months of hell, I had finally found my way to fight back. You see, 3 days earlier, Karen Whitfield had done something so unthinkable, so cruel that it changed everything I thought I knew about the limits of human greed. She had taken my great-grandfather's cabin, the one place on earth that had always been mine, always been safe, and turned it into her personal party venue for the Pine Ridge HOA board. But Karen made one fatal mistake. She never bothered to ask where all that beautiful lake water actually came from. My name is David Chen, and this is the story of how I lost everything I held dear, and then discovered that sometimes the only way to save what matters most is to destroy it completely. What happened next would tear apart our entire HOA expose, decades of corruption, and leave Karen facing criminal charges that could send her to prison for 20 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, back when I still believed that good people could reason with monsters. The Pine Ridge Mountain community sits about 2 hours north of Denver, nestled in a valley where the air still smells like pine sap and wild columbines. It's one of those places that looks like a postcard until you meet the people who run it. I inherited my great-grandfather's property when I was 28, right after the dot-com crash took my job and most of my savings. The cabin sat on 12 acres of pristine wilderness, with a crystal-clear lake that stretched nearly a quarter-mile from shore to shore. Chen's Lake, the old-timers called it, named after my great-grandfather, who had first settled there in 1952. Back then, there was no HOA. There were just neighbors who looked out for each other, who helped with barn raisings and shared vegetables from their gardens. Great-grandfather used to tell me stories about those early days, when the closest thing to a neighborhood dispute was Mrs. Henderson's goats getting loose in the Kowalski's garden. Those days were long gone. The Pine Ridge HOA had formed 15 years ago, supposedly to maintain property values and ensure everyone's homes stayed up to community standards. What it really became was a weapon for busybodies and control freaks to terrorize anyone who didn't conform to their vision of mountain paradise. And at the center of it all was Karen Whitfield. Karen had moved to Pine Ridge 5 years earlier with her husband Greg, a pharmaceutical sales manager who traveled most of the time. She was one of those women who seemed normal at first glance, pleasant smile, perfectly styled blonde hair, always dressed like she was heading to a country club board meeting. But there was something in her eyes, a coldness, that reminded me of a snake deciding whether you were worth biting. Within 6 months of moving in, Karen had gotten herself elected to the HOA board. Within a year, she was the board president, and within 2 years, she had transformed our quiet mountain community into something that felt more like a police state. She started small, the way predators always do. A violation notice here for a lawn that was supposedly too long. A fine there for Christmas lights that stayed up past January 15. Nothing that seemed worth fighting over individually, but collectively, they created an atmosphere of fear and resentment. The first time Karen set her sights on me was during the summer of my 2nd year in the cabin. I had been hosting a small family reunion, maybe 20 people total, including kids and elderly relatives. We had a barbecue down by the lake, played some music, enjoyed the kind of gathering that made life worth living. The next morning, I found a violation notice taped to my door. Excessive noise complaint, it read. unauthorized use of common areas, failure to obtain proper permits for large gatherings. Fine, $500, payable within 30 days. I stared at that notice for a long time, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. Common areas? The lake was on my property. It always had been. The deed was crystal clear about that. I called Karen directly, thinking this was obviously some kind of mistake. "Oh, David," she said in that syrup-sweet voice that made my skin crawl. "I'm so sorry about the confusion, but you see, the lake technically extends onto HOA common property. According to our updated covenants, any gathering of more than 10 people requires board approval, especially if it involves use of water features." "Water features?" I repeated. "Karen, this is my family's lake. We've been here for 70 years. "Well, that may be how things used to work," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "But we have new rules now. Rules that everyone needs to follow if we want to maintain our property values." I hung up and immediately called my lawyer, Jim Morrison, not the rock star, just a good man who specialized in property law and had helped me with the inheritance paperwork. Jim listened to everything, asked a few questions, and then delivered news that hit me like a punch to the gut. "David," he said slowly, "I'm going to need to review all the HOA documentation, but if they've amended their covenants and got proper approval, they might have a legal leg to stand on. Property law in Colorado can be complicated when it comes to water rights and common areas." That was the beginning of what would become a 6-month nightmare that nearly destroyed everything I cared about. But Karen was just getting started. The harassment began in earnest about 2 weeks after that first violation notice. I would wake up to find Karen, or one of her HOA board cronies, walking around my property with clipboards, taking photos, measuring things. When I confronted them, they always had some official excuse checking for covenant violations, updating property assessments, investigating noise complaints. The violation notices started coming weekly. My dock was supposedly in violation of waterfront aesthetic guidelines. My vegetable garden was not in keeping with community landscaping standards. Even my bird feeders were cited as unauthorized wildlife feeding stations. Each violation came with a fine. $50 here, $100 there. Nothing individually devastating, but they added up quickly. And Karen made it clear that unpaid fines would result in liens against my property. "You know, David," she told me during one particularly unpleasant encounter, "life would be so much easier if you just worked with us instead of fighting every little thing. The board has been discussing some really exciting possibilities for community development, and your property would be perfect for what we have in mind." "What kind of development?" I asked. Her smile was razor sharp. "Oh, nothing too dramatic. Just some improvements that would benefit everyone. A community clubhouse, maybe. Some shared recreational facilities. Really maximize the potential of that beautiful lakefront." The blood drained from my face. "You want to take my property?" "Not take," she said, her voice dripping false reasonableness. "Develop, for the good of the community. Of course, we'd make sure you were fairly compensated. The property's not for sale. Everything's for sale, David. It's just a matter of price." That night, I called Jim Morrison again. This time, his news was even worse. "David, they're being very aggressive here, but they're staying just inside the legal boundaries. The violation system is legitimate, annoying as hell, but legitimate. And if the fines pile up enough, they can force a sale to satisfy the lion." "How much would that take?" Jim was quiet for a long moment. "In Colorado? With the way the laws are written? They could probably force a sale if the lions exceed 20% of the property's assessed value. On a property like yours, we're probably talking about 40 or 50,000 in accumulated fines." I felt the world tilt beneath my feet. "How long would that take?" At the rate you're describing? Maybe 8 months. A year if you fight every violation. That was when I realized Karen wasn't just harassing me. She was executing a plan. A systematic, calculated plan to steal my family's land. The next few months were a blur of legal filings, HOA meetings, and sleepless nights. I hired Jim to fight every violation notice, which slowed the process, but cost me money I didn't have. I started attending HOA board meetings, where Karen would smile pleasantly while denying my appeals with parliamentary efficiency. The worst part wasn't the legal battles or the mounting costs. It was watching my neighbors, people I had known for years, people who had eaten at my table and swum in my lake, turn against me one by one. It started with whispered conversations that stopped when I walked by. Then came the cold shoulders at the general store, the sudden lack of invitations to community events. Karen had somehow convinced them that I was the problem, that my refusal to cooperate was threatening everyone's property values. "You're being unreasonable, David," my neighbor Sandra told me one day as I picked up my mail. Sandra had been friendly for years, had even brought me casseroles after my divorce. Now she looked at me like I was something unpleasant she had stepped in. "Karen's just trying to make improvements. Why can't you work with her?" "Because she's trying to steal my land," I said. Sandra's expression hardened. "No one's trying to steal anything. You just can't accept that times change." By December, the fines had reached $37,000. Jim was working miracles keeping lions off the property, but we both knew it was only a matter of time. The legal fees were killing me, and Karen seemed to have unlimited resources for the fight. That was when things got truly ugly. I came home one evening in mid-December to find my cabin's front door standing wide open. My first thought was burglary, but nothing seemed to be missing. It wasn't until I went to bed that I realized what had happened. Someone had been in my bedroom. Personal items had been moved, drawers had been opened and closed. My computer had been accessed, the password screen was up, like someone had tried to log in multiple times. Most disturbing of all, my great-grandfather's journal, the one that contained all his stories about building the cabin and the early days of the community, was missing from the bedside table where I always kept it. I called the sheriff's department, but without clear evidence of burglary, there wasn't much they could do. The deputy who took the report was sympathetic but realistic. "Mr. Chen, I'll be honest with you," he said. "These HOA disputes can get nasty, and unless someone actually takes something valuable or does property damage, our hands are pretty tied." "They were in my bedroom," I said. "They touched my personal things." "I understand, and I'm not minimizing that. But without evidence of who did it or what they took, it's hard to build a case." I didn't sleep for 3 days after that. Every sound outside made me jump. Every shadow seemed threatening. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel safe in the place that had always been my sanctuary. But Karen wasn't done with me yet. The worst was still coming. 2 weeks later, on New Year's Eve, I received a certified letter that made my blood run cold. It was from the HOA board, signed by Karen in her capacity as president. Due to ongoing violations and accumulated unpaid fines, it read, "The Pine Ridge HOA Board hereby exercises its right of emergency property management under Section 15.3 of the Community Covenants. Effective immediately, access to the lake and associated recreational facilities is restricted pending resolution of outstanding issues. Property owner will be permitted supervised access for maintenance purposes only." They were taking my lake, my great-grandfather's lake, the heart of everything that made the property worth fighting for. I drove down to the water that night, shaking with rage and despair. Someone had already installed a chain-link fence around the entire shoreline, complete with NOTRESP, ASSI, NGHO, APROPER, TY signs every 20 feet. As I stood there in the snow, Staring at what had been stolen from me, I heard footsteps behind me. It didn't have to be this way, David. I turned to find Karen standing about 10 feet away, bundled up in an expensive parka, her breath forming little clouds in the frigid air. "You could have just worked with us," she continued, "but you had to be stubborn. You had to make this difficult." "This is my family's land," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Was," she corrected, "past tense. The lake is ours now, and soon the rest will follow. The board has exciting plans, David. Big plans. We're going to turn this into something really special." She started to walk away, then paused and looked back over her shoulder. "Oh, and David? We're having a New Year's party tomorrow night. Right here by the lake. Board members and their guests only, of course. I do hope the noise won't bother you." That was when I knew Karen had made her first real mistake. Because she was so focused on taking what she wanted, she had forgotten to ask the most important question of all. Where did all that beautiful lake water come from? I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with every piece of paper related to my property spread out in front of me: deeds, surveys, water rights documentation, my great-grandfather's journal, which I had found hidden in my truck's glove compartment after the break-in, confirming my suspicions about who had been in my cabin. Great-grandfather had been meticulous about record-keeping. Every improvement to the property, every legal filing, every agreement with neighbors, he had documented all of it in his careful engineer's handwriting. As I read through decades of entries, a picture began to emerge that I had never fully understood before. Chen's Lake wasn't natural. Great-grandfather had built it. In 1955, 3 years after settling on the land, he had constructed an earthwork dam across the seasonal creek that ran through the valley. The lake had filled over the course of 2 winters, creating the pristine waters that had defined my family's property for nearly 70 years. But here was the crucial detail I had overlooked. The dam wasn't just on my property. It was my property. Great-grandfather had purchased an additional 40-acre tract specifically to control the water source, ensuring that no one could ever threaten the lake by interfering with the creek upstream. I found the deed in a folder I hadn't opened in years, buried under more recent documents. 40 acres of wilderness, technically separate from the main cabin property, stretching up into the mountains where the creek originated. Land that the HOA had never even known existed. Land that included the dam controls. My hands were shaking as I pulled out the original engineering drawings. Great-grandfather had designed the dam with a manual release system, a series of gates that could be opened to drain the lake for maintenance or emergency purposes. The controls were housed in a small concrete building about half a mile upstream from the lake, camouflaged among the trees and accessible only by an old hiking trail. I had played around that building as a kid during family visits, never really understanding what it was for. Great-grandfather had just called it the water house and told me it was dangerous to play with the machinery inside. Now I understood exactly what that machinery could do. But even with this knowledge, I wasn't ready to do anything drastic. Karen might be a monster, but draining the lake would destroy the ecosystem that had taken decades to establish. It would kill the fish, devastate the wildlife, and eliminate the thing I was fighting so hard to protect. There had to be another way. I called Jim Morrison first thing New Year's morning, despite the holiday. "Jim, I need you to research something for me," I said. "I need to know exactly what authority the HOA has over water rights, especially regarding artificial lakes created by private landowners." "David, it's New Year's Day. Can this wait until—" "Jim," I interrupted, "they're having a party tonight, at my lake, with 200 guests. I need to know my legal options before they destroy everything my family built." Something in my voice must have convinced him, because Jim sighed and said he'd start making calls. While I waited for Jim to get back to me, I decided to take a walk up to the Waterhouse. It had been years since I'd made the hike, and I wanted to see the condition of the dam controls. The trail was overgrown, but still passable. As I climbed through the snow-covered pines, I could hear the sound of preparations down at the lake trucks arriving, people shouting instructions, the whir of power tools. Karen wasn't wasting any time turning my family's sanctuary into her personal entertainment venue. The Waterhouse sat exactly where I remembered it, a small concrete cube partially hidden by mountain laurel and covered with decades of pine needles. The heavy steel door was secured with the same padlock great-grandfather had installed, though the metal was rusty now. I had kept the key all these years without really knowing why. It hung on my keychain alongside my truck and cabin keys, just another piece of my inheritance that I'd never had reason to use. Something from a World War I submarine, thick steel wheels, brass gauges, pipes marked with faded warning labels. Everything was covered in dust and spiderwebs, but the metal showed no signs of corrosion. Great-grandfather had built things to last. A series of instructional plaques explained the operation in simple terms. The main gate could be opened gradually to control water flow, or quickly in case of emergency. A complete drain would take approximately 8 hours under normal conditions. 8 hours. That would put the lake at its lowest point, just as Karen's party was reaching its peak. I was still staring at the controls when my phone rang. Jim's voice was tight with excitement. "David, I've got good news and bad news." "Which do you want first?" "Bad news. The HOA does have some authority over common water features, but only if they're genuinely common. The problem is, their covenants are vague enough that a court might side with them, especially if they can prove community use over time." My heart sank. "And the good news?" "The good news is that they have zero authority over privately constructed water retention systems on privately owned land. If you built it, and it's on your property, it's yours to control. Period. What if the HOA claims they've established some kind of community ownership through use? Doesn't matter. Water rights in Colorado are clear-cut when it comes to artificial systems. The person who builds it controls it. Full stop. They can use it, drain it, or fill it with concrete if they want to." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath of the cold mountain air. "Jim, let me ask you a hypothetical question. If someone were to, say, temporarily drain a lake for maintenance purposes, would that be legal? If it's their lake, absolutely. Property owners drain artificial lakes all the time for dam inspection, dredging, fish management, whatever. As long as they're not violating any environmental regulations or damaging downstream properties, it's perfectly legal. Even if it happened to inconvenience an unauthorized party taking place on their property." Jim was quiet for a moment. "David, what are you planning?" "I'm not planning anything," I said. "I'm just trying to understand my rights." "Your rights are clear. But David, whatever you're thinking about doing, make sure you can live with the consequences. Because once you cross certain lines, there's no going back." After I hung up, I stood there in the Waterhouse for a long time, staring at the control wheels and thinking about consequences. Karen had spent 6 months systematically destroying my life, turning my neighbors against me, and stealing everything my family had built over 7 decades. Now she was literally partying on my property, celebrating her victory while I watched from the sidelines like a defeated enemy. But I kept thinking about what Jim had said. Once you cross certain lines, there's no going back. The question was, had Karen already crossed those lines for me? Down in the valley, I could see cars starting to arrive for the party. Expensive SUVs and luxury sedans, probably belonging to HOA board members and their friends. People who had never given a damn about this place until it became useful for their social climbing. That was when I made my decision. I walked back down the trail to my cabin, put on my warmest clothes, grabbed a thermos of coffee and a comfortable chair, and returned to the Waterhouse. If I was going to do this, I wanted to do it right. Karen's party was scheduled to start at 8 p.m. By my calculations, if I opened the main gate at 6 o'clock, the lake would be at its lowest point by 2 a.m., right when everyone would be expecting to ring in the new year with champagne and fireworks over the water. Instead, they were going to get mud, dead fish, and the sight of 70 years of memories disappearing into the darkness. At exactly 6 p.m., I turned the main control wheel counterclockwise until it stopped. The sound of rushing water filled the winter air, and Karen's reign of terror began its countdown to an end. The first hour was almost peaceful. I sat in my chair outside the waterhouse, sipping coffee and listening to the steady rush of water flowing through the open dam gates. Down in the valley, I could see the glow of party lights and hear the distant sound of music and laughter. Karen's guests were arriving in force. I counted at least 50 vehicles in the makeshift parking area she had created on what used to be my meadow. Every few minutes, another set of headlights would wind down the access road, bringing more people to celebrate at my expense. They had no idea what was coming. By 7:30, the lake level had dropped about 2 feet. Not enough to be obvious from a distance, especially in the dark, but enough that anyone who knew the water intimately would notice something was wrong. The wooden dock that great-grandfather had built was starting to look awkwardly tall, and the shoreline was beginning to reveal the muddy margin that usually stayed hidden underwater. I could hear the party getting louder, more animated. Someone had brought a DJ setup, and the bass was thumping across the water with a kind of obnoxious volume that would have earned me a violation notice if I'd been the one hosting. But Karen's rules apparently didn't apply to Karen. At 8:15, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Having a wonderful time at YOUR Lake. Wish you were here. K. She had included a selfie of herself, and about 20 other people posing by the water's edge, everyone holding champagne glasses and grinning like they'd just won the lottery. In the background, I could see the lake looking almost normal in the party lights, still deep enough to hide what was happening. I typed back, "Enjoy it while it lasts." By 9 o'clock, things were starting to get interesting. The water level had dropped nearly 4 feet, and the shoreline had receded enough that people were beginning to notice. Through my binoculars, I could see clusters of party guests pointing at the water and having animated conversations. My phone started ringing around 9:15. Karen's voice was sharp with annoyance when I answered. "David, what are you doing to the lake?" "I'm not doing anything to the lake," I said calmly. "I'm performing routine maintenance on my water retention system." "You're what?" "David, stop playing games. The water level is dropping, and my guests are starting to ask questions." "I'm sorry to hear that. You should probably wrap up your unauthorized party before things get worse." "Worse? What do you mean worse?" I looked down at the lake, where the water had now dropped low enough to reveal the old tree stumps that great-grandfather had never removed when he first flooded the valley. They looked like skeletal fingers pointing up through the murky water. "Karen, you're having a party on my property without permission, using my facilities without authorization, and generally trespassing on land that my family has owned for 70 years. The neighborly thing to do would be to pack up your guests and leave before this gets embarrassing." "You can't do this," she screamed. "We have rights." The HOA has no rights to my private water system," I interrupted. "I checked with my lawyer. I can drain it, fill it, or turn it into a giant mud pit if I want to. It's my lake, Karen. It always was." I hung up and turned off my phone. By 10:30, the situation had become impossible to ignore. The lake was down almost 6 feet, and what had once been a pristine mountain pool now looked like a partially drained bathtub. The party music had stopped, replaced by the sounds of angry voices and car doors slamming. Through my binoculars, I could see people loading their cars and leaving, clearly not interested in staying for whatever drama was unfolding. The smart ones were getting out early, leaving Karen to deal with the consequences of her arrogance. But Karen wasn't giving up easily. Around 11 p.m., I saw headlights coming up the old hiking trail toward the Waterhouse. Someone was trying to reach the dam controls, probably hoping to reverse what I had done. I was ready for them. "That's far enough," I called out as the truck stopped about 50 yards away. The headlights were blinding, but I could make out two figures getting out of the vehicle. "David," Karen's voice carried clearly through the cold air. "You open those gates right now. You're destroying community property?" "I'm maintaining my private dam system," I called back. "You're trespassing on my land, again." "This is Greg Whitfield," the second voice said, Karen's husband, who I'd met maybe twice in 5 years. "We just want to talk. Then talk from there. Don't come any closer." "David, be reasonable." Karen's voice had shifted to what she probably thought was a persuasive tone. "We can work this out. The board is willing to discuss a compromise." The time for compromise was 6 months ago, before you started your campaign to steal my property. "No one's trying to steal anything." I laughed, a sound that echoed strangely off the surrounding trees. "Karen, you fined me nearly $40,000, filed liens against my property, broken into my cabin, fenced off my lake, and thrown a party in my backyard without permission. What exactly would you call that? Community improvement? You know what I call it. And fraud. And probably a few other crimes that the district attorney is going to be very interested in hearing about." That was when Greg stepped in, his voice trying for a reasonable man-to-man tone. "David, look, maybe things got out of hand. Maybe we can find a way to work together going forward. But right now, you're damaging property that affects the whole community." "The only property I'm affecting is my own," I said. "And the only people being damaged are the ones who shouldn't have been here in the first place." I could hear them arguing in hushed voices, but I couldn't make out the words. After a few minutes, Greg called out again. "David, we're going to call the sheriff. What you're doing is illegal." "Go ahead," I said. "Call them. I'd love to explain to a deputy sheriff how you've been harassing me for 6 months and are now trespassing on my property in the middle of the night." More hushed arguing, then the sound of car doors slamming. The truck backed down the trail, leaving me alone with the sound of rushing water and my own racing heartbeat. At midnight, as what remained of Karen's party was reaching its climactic New Year's countdown, the lake hit its lowest point. 7 decades of memories reduced to a muddy crater, dotted with confused fish flopping in shallow puddles and the skeletal remains of long-drowned trees. I could hear shouting from down in the valley, voices raised in anger and disbelief. Car engines were starting, headlights were moving, and Karen's grand celebration was turning into a rout. But the night wasn't over yet. At 12:30 a.m., I saw the red and blue flashing lights coming down the access road. Karen had made good on her threat to call the sheriff, and now I was going to have to explain myself to a deputy who probably just wanted to go home and sleep off his own New Year's celebration. I walked down from the Waterhouse to meet them, taking my time and thinking through exactly what I was going to say. The key was to stay calm, stick to the facts, and let Karen's hysteria speak for itself. The deputy who got out of the patrol car was someone I recognized, Mike Torres, a decent guy who'd been to a few community barbecues over the years. Behind him, Karen was practically vibrating with rage, gesturing wildly at the empty lake bed and shouting about property damage and community sabotage. "Evening, David," Mike said, his voice carefully neutral. "We got a call about some kind of property dispute. Mrs. Whitfield here says you've done something to the community lake." "There's no community lake," I said. "There's my lake, on my property, which I've drained for maintenance purposes." "Maintenance!" Karen shrieked. "He's lying. He did this to sabotage our party. He's destroyed community property." Mike looked from Karen to the empty lake bed, then back to me. "David, you mind explaining what's going on here?" I pulled out the deed for the 40-acre tract, along with great-grandfather's engineering drawings and the water rights documentation. "Deputy Torres, this lake was built by my great-grandfather in 1955 on privately owned land using privately owned water sources. The dam, the controls, and the lake itself are all my personal property. I have every legal right to maintain my water system as I see fit." Karen grabbed the papers out of my hands before Mike could look at them. "This is fake. This is all fabricated. The lake belongs to the community. The HOA has—" "Ma'am," Mike said firmly, "I need you to calm down and let me see those documents." As Mike examined the paperwork with his flashlight, Karen kept ranting about community property and malicious destruction, but I could see in his expression that he was beginning to understand the reality of the situation. "Mrs. Whitfield," Mike said finally, "according to these documents, Mr. Chen owns the water system. If that's accurate, he has the right to operate it as he sees fit. But the party," she wailed, "he ruined our party." "What party?" Mike asked. That was when Karen realized she had just confessed to trespassing. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before she tried to recover. "I mean, the community gathering, the authorized HOA event. On his property?" Mike asked. "Did you have Mr. Chen's permission for this gathering?" Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, which, given the circumstances, seemed appropriate. Mike handed the documents back to me and turned to Karen. "Ma'am, I think you need to gather up your remaining guests and leave Mr. Chen's property. If you have a dispute about property rights or HOA authority, that's a civil matter for the courts." "But he," Karen started. "Ma'am," Mike interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of someone who dealt with too many drunk people on New Year's Eve. "You're on his property without permission. I strongly suggest you leave before this becomes a trespassing issue." As Karen and Greg loaded into their truck, she rolled down the window for one last parting shot. "This isn't over, David. You think you're so smart, but you have no idea what you've started." I watched their taillights disappear down the access road, then turned back to Mike. "Deputy Torres, I appreciate you coming out here on New Year's Eve." "Just doing my job," he said, then paused. "David, I've got to ask, did you really drain the whole lake just to mess with their party?" I looked out at the empty crater where my family's lake had been, thinking about how to answer that question honestly. "Mike," I said finally, "I drained the lake because it needed maintenance and because it's my right to do so. The fact that it inconvenienced some trespassers was just coincidental." Mike grinned and shook his head. "Well, it's going to be one hell of a New Year's story." But as I watched his patrol car drive away, I realized Karen had been right about one thing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The lake took 3 weeks to refill once I closed the dam gates. 3 weeks during which Karen Whitfield made the biggest mistake of her entire campaign against me. She tried to have me arrested for environmental destruction. What Karen didn't realize was that filing false charges against someone is a crime, and when those false charges are part of a systematic pattern of harassment designed to steal someone's property, well, that's when the FBI gets interested in your HOA activities. The environmental charges were dismissed within 48 hours. The Colorado Department of Natural Resources sent an inspector who confirmed that my lake was entirely artificial, entirely on my property, and entirely within my rights to manage as I saw fit. No endangered species, no downstream impact, no violation of any environmental statutes. But the investigation Karen had triggered kept going, because it turns out that when federal agents start looking into HOA financial records, they sometimes find very interesting things. Like the fact that Karen had been systematically inflating violation fines and pocketing the difference. Like the fact that she had been using HOA funds to pay for personal legal expenses related to property acquisitions. Like the fact that she had been forging board meeting minutes to authorize expenditures that had never been voted on. The FBI raid on the Pine Ridge HOA offices happened on a Tuesday morning in March. I happened to be getting my mail when 6 federal agents and 2 accountants walked into the community building carrying boxes of evidence, bags after the community Lake Day disaster. I couldn't sleep. I'd lie in bed listening to every sound, wondering if it was another group of trespassers treating my property like their personal resort. The legal bills were mounting. Tom was cautiously optimistic about our chances in court, but optimistic about an outcome that was still months away. That's when I decided to dig through my grandfather's papers more thoroughly than I had during the estate settlement. I'd been so focused on the immediate practical concerns, taxes, maintenance, utilities, that I hadn't really examined the historical documents. But Karen's comment about pressure had me thinking about leverage, and I had a hunch that a man smart enough to build a lake and dam from scratch might have been smart enough to protect it legally. Grandpa Chen had been methodical about record-keeping. Everything was organized in file folders, labeled in his precise handwriting, stored in fireproof cabinets, in what he called his office, really just a converted closet off the main room. I'd been through the obvious stuff, property deeds, tax records, insurance policies. But that night, I started digging deeper. The breakthrough came in a folder labeled Water Rights and Dam Permits 1952, 1978. Inside were documents I'd barely glanced at before, assuming they were just historical curiosities. What I found was far more interesting than that. The first document was a water rights permit issued by the state in 1951, giving my grandfather exclusive rights to divert and impound water from Clearwater Creek for the creation of Mirror Lake. Nothing unusual there. Anyone building a dam would need similar permits. But the second document made me sit up straight. It was a memorandum of understanding between my grandfather and the county, dated 1953, regarding downstream water flow obligations. Apparently, when he'd built the dam, there had been concerns about how impounding water might affect downstream users. The memo laid out specific flow requirements that my grandfather agreed to maintain. Here's where it got interesting. The memo included a clause stating that if the downstream area was ever developed for residential use, the water rights holder, my grandfather, and by inheritance, me, would have the authority to modify flow rates as needed to protect the lake ecosystem, provided adequate notice was given to downstream residents. I read that section 3 times before the implications sank in. Every house in Pinnacle Ridge was downstream from my dam. Every house relied on Clearwater Creek for their landscaping, their decorative ponds, their million-dollar views of flowing water through their neighborhoods. And I had the legal right to restrict that flow. But that wasn't even the best part. The best part was in the third document, addendum to the original agreement filed in 1978. By then, Grandpa Chen had apparently anticipated future development and had negotiated additional protections. The addendum stated that any upstream water rights holder whose property became subject to recreational access disputes could temporarily reduce downstream flow to protect their primary water source, regardless of impact on secondary users. In plain English, if people were trying to take my lake, I could legally reduce the water flow that fed their fancy creek views and ornamental water features. I called Tom Breslin at 7 in the morning. "You found what?" he said, and I could hear the excitement creeping into his usually measured voice. "Water rights documentation, with flow modification clauses. Karen's entire development depends on creek flow that I can legally control. Fax me everything, now." An hour later, Tom called back. "Robert, this is incredible. I've never seen anything like this. Your grandfather basically negotiated himself a nuclear option. Is it enforceable? Not only enforceable, it's ironclad. These are state-level water rights, filed with both the county and state water authority. They supersede any local zoning or HOA regulations." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. So I can just reduce the flow. With proper notice, yes. The law requires you to notify downstream users at least 72 hours before any significant flow modification. But once that notice period expires, you have full authority to manage your water rights as you see fit. For the first time in months, I felt something like hope. Karen Mitchell had all the tools of a modern HOA lawyers, political connections, community pressure. But my grandfather had given me something more powerful, legal rights that predated her entire development by 50 years. I spent the rest of the day researching water law and studying topographical maps of the area. What I found was even better than I'd hoped. Clearwater Creek didn't just flow through Pinnacle Ridge, it was the aesthetic centerpiece of the entire development. The promotional materials I found online were full of phrases like tranquil waterside living and the gentle sounds of flowing water. Several of the most expensive homes had been built specifically to overlook creekside parks and water features. If I reduced the flow to the minimum required for basic ecosystem maintenance, Karen's luxury development would turn into an expensive subdivision built around a muddy trickle. But I wanted to be absolutely sure before I played this card. I drove down to the county planning office and spent an afternoon reviewing development permits and environmental impact studies. What I learned was fascinating. Pinnacle Ridge had been sold to residents as a water-oriented community. The developer had specifically marketed the creek views, the sound of flowing water, the natural water features that made the development unique. Some homeowners had paid premiums of $200,000 or more for creekfront lots. Even more importantly, the HOA's own covenants required maintenance of aesthetic water features as part of their community standards. If the creek flow dropped significantly, they could face liability issues with homeowners who'd paid premium prices for waterside lots that no longer had water. This was leverage. Real leverage. The kind that could end Karen's harassment campaign in a single stroke. But I wasn't ready to use it yet. I needed more information, and I needed to be strategic about timing. Karen had been planning her campaign against me for months. I needed to be equally thoughtful about my response. That's when I remembered something Pete Morrison had mentioned. Pete had been complaining about increased traffic on the back roads, mentioning that Karen had been making a lot of trips to his area recently. Pete lived upstream from me, which seemed odd if Karen's interest was really in my lake. I decided to pay Pete a visit. Pete Morrison was 72 years old, a retired engineer who'd moved to the area 30 years earlier for the same reasons my grandfather had: peace, quiet, and independence. He lived in a modest cabin about 2 miles upstream from my property, on a parcel that bordered state forest land. When I explained what I'd found in my grandfather's papers, Pete's weathered face broke into the biggest grin I'd seen from him in years. "Water rights," he said, shaking his head. "Your grandfather was always thinking ahead. I remember when he filed all those papers back in the 70s. We thought he was being paranoid about development. You said Karen had been visiting your area. What's that about?" Pete's expression darkened. "That woman's been sniffing around up here for months, asking questions about property lines, water sources, access roads. Last month, she brought some surveyors up here. That got my attention." "Surveyors? For what?" That's what I wondered. "They were real interested in the section of creek that runs through state land. Kept measuring distances and taking water flow readings." A cold certainty settled in my stomach. Pete, I think Karen's planning something bigger than just taking my lake. We spent the next hour driving the back roads, following the creek upstream from my property. What we found confirmed my worst fears. Fresh survey stakes marked at regular intervals along the creek bed. New blazes on trees marking potential access routes. And most damning of all, a folder of papers that had apparently been dropped by one of the surveyors, containing preliminary plans for something called Phase 2 Upper Creek Development. Karen wasn't just after my lake. She was planning to develop the entire watershed. My property was just the first domino in a much larger scheme that would turn 20 miles of pristine mountain creek into a series of luxury developments. That evening, I called Tom with my findings. His response was immediate and decisive. File the water flow modification notice tomorrow. Don't wait. If she's planning upstream development, she might try to establish prior use claims that could complicate your water rights. How much notice do I have to give? 72 hours for significant modification. But Robert, be prepared. When you do this, there's no going back. She's going to come at you with everything she's got. I thought about that as I sat on my dock that night, looking out over the lake that had been the center of my world for as long as I could remember. Karen Mitchell had made it clear that she saw my attachment to this place as weakness, something to be exploited and eventually overcome. But she'd made a critical error in her calculations. She'd assumed that because I was quiet, I was weak. That because I preferred peace, I wouldn't fight. That because I loved this place, I couldn't bear to see it change. What she didn't understand was that love like this doesn't make you weak. It makes you dangerous. The next morning, I drafted the required notice letter and hand-delivered it to the Pinnacle Ridge HOA office. The certified letter was professional, clinical, and devastating. Notice is hereby given that pursuant to state water rights, permit WR 1951, 447 and County Memorandum of Understanding dated March 15, 1953, water flow from Clearwater Creek will be reduced to minimum. Ecological maintenance levels, effective 72 hours from receipt of this notice. This modification is being implemented in response to ongoing recreational access disputes and is within the full legal rights of the upstream water rights holder. I also sent copies to every homeowner in Pinnacle Ridge, the County Planning Office, and the State Water Authority. By noon, my phone was ringing nonstop. Karen's first call came at 12:47 p.m. Her voice was tight with barely controlled rage. "You can't do this." "I can, and I am." "Do you have any idea what this will do to property values? To the community?" About as much idea as you had about what your harassment campaign would do to my life. There was a long pause. "We can work something out. A compromise." The time for compromise was before you turned my family's property into your community entertainment center. Robert, be reasonable. You're talking about destroying hundreds of thousands of dollars in property values over a personal dispute. I'm talking about exercising my legal water rights. Rights that predate your development by half a century. I hung up before she could respond. Over the next 72 hours, I received calls from lawyers, threats from homeowners, and even a visit from a county commissioner who wanted to discuss the situation. Everyone wanted to negotiate, to find middle ground, to work out a deal that would let Karen keep harassing me while preserving their creek views. But I'd learned something important from watching Karen operate. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply say no and mean it. At exactly 6 a.m. on Saturday morning, 3 days after delivering my notice, I walked down to the dam and opened the flow control valve to its minimum setting. The change was immediate and dramatic. What had been a rushing creek became a gentle trickle within hours. By noon, the calls started coming in about the water emergency in Pinnacle Ridge. Decorative fountains had run dry. Creekside landscaping was already showing stress. The gentle babbling brook that had been the soundtrack of luxury living had become a muddy ditch. But that was just the beginning. Because while I'd been learning about water rights and legal leverage, I'd also been planning for the inevitable escalation. Karen Mitchell wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully, and I knew my water rights gambit would only make her more determined to destroy me. What I didn't know was how far she'd be willing to go, or how personal she'd make it. But I was about to find out, because Karen's next move wouldn't be legal or bureaucratic. It would be desperate, vicious, and ultimately, the mistake that would give me everything I needed to end our war once and for all. The retaliation came faster than I expected, and it was more vicious than anything Karen had tried before. 2 days after I reduced the creek flow, I woke up to find my driveway blocked by a county road crew. Not unusual in itself, rural roads need maintenance. But when I walked out to ask about the work, the crew chief handed me an official notice: emergency road closure due to structural concerns with the access bridge over Clearwater Creek. The bridge in question was a simple concrete span my grandfather had built in the 1960 SI. It had weathered 50 years of Montana winters without so much as a crack. But according to the notice, signed by the county engineering department, recent hydrological changes had undermined the foundation and created a safety hazard requiring immediate closure. I was effectively trapped on my own property, cut off from the outside world by a bureaucratic maneuver that had Karen Mitchell's called Coding Coach. This app teaches people how to become better programmers. They upload a file of code, they've written it, makes a call to the Claude API to evaluate the code, and gives them an overall score out of 100 along with a set of suggestions on how to make the code better from a production readiness and maintainability perspective. /nin evaluating code, you should use the following guidelines and principles. /none, descriptive names, use descriptive names for classes, functions, and variables. /none2, function size functions, should be focused. Try and avoid functions that are 200 plus lines long. But also avoid small functions /u3c5 lines of code if the function is only called once, unless it is a public function that is part of a class. /n3, make dependencies explicit, avoid global state and hidden dependencies. /n4, error handling, generally try to avoid blanket swallowing all errors with empty try/catch blocks. /n5, avoid too many levels of nesting of control structures/blocks. More than 2-3 levels is hard to follow. /n6, make side effects obvious. /n7, avoid magic numbers. And the aesthetic of this app should be dark mode. Use dark grays for background, blue for buttons. Self, next F. Push, 11B, 665 self. Next F. Push 1. Create an interactive language learning tutor in an artifact with the following features. Core functionality, implement a UI with a language selector dropdown. Include languages like Spanish, French, German, Japanese, Italian, etc. Allow users to have natural conversations with the tutor in their chosen language. Use the Claude API window. Claude Complete to generate contextually appropriate responses in the selected language learning feedback system. Build dynamic feedback mechanisms that analyze each user message for grammar, vocabulary, and syntax. Display real-time feedback in a side panel. E.g., nice use of past tense. Or try using pour instead of para in this context. Track common errors and areas for improvement. Provide gentle corrections without interrupting conversation. Flow personalized learning goals. Automatically identify users' proficiency level based on their interactions. Generate and display 3-5 specific learning goals, e.g. master irregular verb conjugations or expand food-related vocabulary. allow users to manually add/edit goals, adapt conversation topics to align with these goals, progress tracking, visualize learning progress. With simple charts or progress bars track vocabulary growth, grammar improvement, and conversation duration. Maintain a learning journal that summarizes each session UI requirements. Clean, intuitive interface with clear separation between conversation area and feedback mobile. Responsive design, visual indicators for language proficiency levels, option to toggle between casual chat and structured lessons. Self. Next, F. Push 1C T6B0 Self. Next, F. Push 1. Create a React app based on the following specs. Polingo is an interactive web-based Python learning platform that teaches programming fundamentals through a gamified, hands-on coding experience. The application features a structured curriculum of 15 progressive levels, covering essential Python concepts from basic Hello World programs to advanced topics like functions, loops, and data structure. Each level presents users with a clear task, educational context, and a practical coding exercise that must be completed using the integrated dark-themed code editor that mimics professional development environments. And the platform provides comprehensive learning support through immediate feedback validation, detailed explanations, and contextual hints. When users submit code, the system compares their input against expected outputs and provides instant correctness assessment. Incorrect submissions display the expected solution alongside educational explanations to reinforce learning, while optional hints can be toggled on demand for additional guidance. Users can also reset their progress on any level to practice until mastery is achieved. And strong gamification elements drive user engagement through streak tracking, consecutive correct answers, progress visualization, and completion badges. The interface includes a header progress bar, level completion indicators, and an intuitive level selector that allows flexible navigation between unlocked levels with color-coded completion status. Built with React and Tailwind CSS, the responsive design features a clean blue and white color scheme with professional layout that balances educational functionality with visual appeal across different devices. Self. Next, F. Push 1D T7B Self. Next, F. Push 1. Create a connecting 4 dots game called Join Dots with the following features: core game mechanics, standard join dots rules, 6 rows 7 columns grid, 2 players, human, red, vs AI Claude, yellow, win by connecting 4 pieces in a row, horizontal, vertical, or diagonal pieces. Drop with smooth animation when placed. Show the last move with a ring highlight winning pieces with a pulsing animation. AI integration. Use window, Claude. Complete to power the AI opponent 3 difficulty levels. Easy, play casually. Sometimes make random moves. Don't always block wins. Medium, play well but occasionally miss opportunities. Hard, play strategically, always block wins. Create opportunities, think ahead. Show Claude's thinking process in a side panel. Format the board state for Claude. Using a SCII representation, AI should analyze immediate wins, blocking opponent, future opportunities. UI/UX design, modern dark theme with gradient backgrounds, animated background with floating gradient orbs, purple, blue, pink, glass morphism effects, on panel smooth hover effects showing where pieces will drop. Color scheme, background, dark blue/slate gradients, red player, red/play, radiant with glow effects, yellow player, yellow/orange gradients with glow effects, responsive layout with game board on left, AI thinking panel on right. Game flow. Start with difficulty selection screen. Show current player's turn with colored indicator display with